Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Annie Drinkard, Public and Media Relations Manager for the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. I want to thank you all for joining us today at the SPSP Town Hall, Racial Bias, Use of Force, and Policing, a discussion of social psychological considerations. We'd like everyone to follow this code throughout the event. You can read the full piece if you visit spsp.org and search for Code of Conduct. Today's panelists are Dr. Jack Glaser, Dr. Kimberly Barsamian Kahn, and Dr. Malik Boykin. Malik Boykin is an assistant professor in the Department of Cognitive, Linguistic, and Psychological Sciences at Brown University. His research focuses on intergroup relations, hierarchy, prejudice, mentorship, and racial identity. Dr. Boykin will be leading the discussion, and I now turn the event over to him.
Thank you so much, Annie. As she said, I'm Dr. Malik Boykin, assistant professor at Brown, and also a repeat survivor of racial profiling. And our panelists that we have, Kimberly Barsamian Kahn, an associate professor at Portland State University, who leads the Gender, Race, and Sexual Prejudice Lab, the GRASP Lab, and who's a member of the Center for Policing Equity and co-editor of the JSI Journal of Social Issues special issue titled What Social Science Research Says About Police Violence Against Racial and Ethnic Minorities. As well, we have Jack Glaser, a full professor at the University of California, Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy, where he leads the Psychology and Public Policy Lab, and author of Suspect Race, Causes and Consequences of Racial Profiling. And he serves as one of the principal investigators of the Center for Policing Equity as well. And so what we're gearing up to do is we're going to try to cover a lot of ground, but we can only cover so much in 1 hour. So we're going to try to have a conversation to talk through some of what we know about racial bias, use of force, and policing from a social psychology perspective, and talk about contributions we can make and how we can make sense of some of this as a community of social psychologists, including experts, academics, burgeoning scholars, professors, students, change agents, allies, as well as the targeted, the profiled, and the terrorized. I have a few questions of my own, but I'm largely going to be taking the questions that you all, as the audience put forth. I hear we are going to have potentially 400 folks here, so we won't be able to get to all of the questions, but that's and through to the final question, where then I'll hand it over back to Annie. So first off, wanted to ask to Kimberly and to Jack, what are some of the things that we've learned from working with the police, and what does some of this research show? Wait, what happened? Oh, you're still muted. Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
We weren't allowed to unmute there for a second.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I think we said I would go first, so I will go ahead and do that. And first, I just want to say thank you to SPSP and to Rudy Mendoza-Denton in particular for inviting us to participate in this and for having the vision to do this. My hope is that we can do at least two things, and one of those is to have a forum to talk about the pain that people are feeling, because social personality psychologists are people who think about other people's feelings as well as their own, and about social structure, and so these are things that are, I think, hitting a lot of us very deeply, but also as just citizens of the world. So I hope that this will be a forum for that. And I also hope that it will be a forum for empowering people, because it's my firm belief that social personality psychology has a lot to offer the issue of policing in America and other places. So I'd like to say a few words about that before I get to some of the specific lessons that I've learned. And just by way of a little more background, I am an experimental social psychologist, originally trained primarily in implicit bias research, but for the last 20 years, I've been studying policing, primarily trying to apply what we know about stereotyping and prejudice to policing to help explain the racial disparities we see in policing. And in the process of doing that, learning a lot more about policing itself. So let me just turn to what social personality psychology has to offer policing, just as a framework for what we might end up talking about today. Obviously, there's the issue of stereotyping and prejudice, and social psychology knows more about that than any other field of inquiry. And so we have a lot to offer. We have a century's worth of research on those topics and a lot of understanding about the function, structure, content of stereotypes and by other biases. And they're highly relevant to race and policing. But we also have other general understandings about conformity and social influence that are highly relevant. And if we look at the George Floyd killing, we see a high degree of conformity happening there among the other officers, and a specific type of conformity, which is obedience to authority. And we not only see the junior officers obeying the commands of the senior officer, however horrifically misguided they were, but we also see witnesses who clearly know something is wrong and not feeling like they can intervene for good reason, but nevertheless, what a bizarre situation. And a lot of that can be explained by what we understand from social psychology, that just the understanding of situationism and the power of situations is crucially important to what happens in policing, both in terms of use of force incidents, fatal or otherwise, but also in terms of more mundane but more frequent interactions with the police that nevertheless deprive people of basic liberties. Of course, there are issues of personality, and there's good reason to believe that there are systematic personality differences that differentiate police and civilian populations. And then, finally, we are the field that studies emotion more than any other. And emotion is a huge part of this. Fear. Police officers feel fear when they're in these situations. And of course, civilians feel fear when they're the subjects of scrutiny or force by police. But also anger and contempt and disgust. And so, we know more about fear than about emotion than anybody else. And that's something that we can bring to the table as well. So let me use that to segue to what I've observed in my work with police over the last 20 years or so. And I'm just going to highlight 3 out of the many things that have risen into my consciousness. One is, of course, that police officers are human beings, and they have all of the beauty of humanity and all of the flaws of humanity. And one of those flaws is that they are driven by their emotions, just like the rest of us. And again, I want to come back to the emotion of fear, because I've had officers tell me that they experience tremendous fear when they're in use of force situations. And I've had officers tell me that they've soiled their pants in their first instances of coming under fire or something like that. So they're experiencing intense fear. I'm not trying to justify anything, but I'm trying to highlight the humanity of it and the limitations of those human beings. And one thing to note is that one of the responses we have to fear is flight, but that's typically not available to police officers. And so in the absence of having a flight option, they tend to move toward a fight option. And so that's, I think, one of the fundamental problems. The reality of it is that officers can flee. And there are policies that indicate that officers might have a duty to flee, or at least to withdraw instead of using force. So these are issues that we can speak to. And then finally, one of the things that I've observed is that police officers have a tremendous amount of discretion in what they can do. It's shocking. And it's not scandalous because we all have a lot of discretion in what we can do in our jobs, but it's potentially deadly. And it's also potentially unconstitutional in lots of ways. So these are the issues: high discretion, human normalcy, but flawedness, and the role of emotion, particularly fear, that I think we can speak to with great authority and with great help. And then just on a final note, I want to say that social psychologists are engaged. This morning I was on a call with the New York Police Department and their oversight that they're having, but also on the call were Jennifer Eberhardt and Nick Camp. And at the same time, I was stealing glances at C-SPAN to see Phil Goff, testifying before the House Judiciary Committee. So there is engagement. None of us are uniquely qualified to do that. There is a space for greater engagement by the social personality psychology community. And I will turn it over to Kim. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Jack, for that really nice introduction to some of the larger themes, I think, that us that have done research with police departments and with police officers have sort of gathered over our time researching this topic. So probably just to build on that a little bit and a little bit more of my background, and thanks to Malik for the introduction. I'm an associate professor of social psychology, also trained as an experimental social psychologist, but really do work with a variety of methods and backgrounds now to try to understand this issue of racial bias in policing. I'm interested primarily in contemporary forms of bias, and so how these stereotypes can impact intergroup interactions, often in more sort of subtle or implicit ways as well. And within that, focus on the criminal justice system, and of course then within police departments working on issues of racial bias. And I've been working with police departments for about 15 years on this topic. So my area of research really then is looking at these sort of police community interactions and how stereotypes and biases pervade on both sides of these interactions to lead them to escalate, lead to increases in use of force, and then ultimately, decisions to shoot and fatal force. I've also been involved in a lot of interventions to try to counteract these types of biases with, things on police behavior, looking at things like shooter bias and decisions to shoot, as well as larger scale community interventions focused on community engagement, community policing, and trying to improve then trust between police and the communities that they serve. So I'm really interested in then, again, both perspectives, both the police officer perspective and of course, the community member perspective. So I think Jack hit on some really, key themes, particularly of discretion, where we know stereotypes, of course, are going to be more likely to influence decision-making and behavior is when things are ambiguous, when we're approaching a situation and using our stereotypes or schemas to fill in the pieces of information to lead us to a particular decision or direct a particular behavior. I think it's also important when we're thinking about discretion and the use of stereotypes in this ways. We know that stereotyping is exacerbated under situations of stress. Under high arousal, it narrows our focus and we rely more on those types of biases. Also things like sleep deprivation. We know officers are often, most departments across the United States are understaffed, and that's leading officers to work longer shifts, more overtime. And we do see then when people are sleep deprived and they're tired, they're more likely to rely on stereotypes there as well. We, of course, have a lot of research from social psychology on stereotyping that is applicable to a policing situation. Of course, you've probably seen and heard a lot about implicit bias and its relevance to policing, particularly just, quick decisions that officers make to shoot or not shoot an individual, often under those situational constraints of high arousal, fear, stress, all sort of leading to the reliance on that. As well as just explicit bias. I mean, I think when we're certainly thinking about and looking at, George Floyd's death, this was a longer period of time where, implicit bias was probably less likely playing a role here, and we may see more of that explicit bias and dehumanization process, which we know also has an impact in law enforcement as well as then in the broader community as well. We have a lot of research looking at the dehumanization of African Americans and the implicit connection between African Americans and apes, and how that dehumanization process then, takes away that perceived humanity and can, lead to these situations increasing in force and severity as well. Along with the dehumanization process, we see basic patterns of the underestimation of African Americans' pain. So when victims are, saying they can't breathe or they're in pain, there's a basic underestimation of what that is, that amount of pain for African Americans and racial minorities compared to whites. Not only do we see stereotypes impact ultimate decision-making in these shooter bias situations, these quick shoot, don't shoot situations where people are more likely to mistakenly shoot unarmed African Americans compared to whites, but we see this same bias play out throughout the whole range or continuum of use of force, from low levels of force to, taser use to ultimately fatal force as well. In some of my work, we've broken down and looked at the dyadic interactions that's happening in police community interactions, and we see fundamental differences sort of on the use of de-escalation techniques. More de-escalation is being used when it's a white suspect compared to a racial minority suspect. There's more of a temporal delay, for example, in the use of force escalating. There's more back and forth that's going on with white suspects compared to racial minority suspects, that force gets sort of escalated quicker and jumped to at a faster level. So we see less of that ability to de-escalate a particular situation as well. Just a couple other social psychological variables I'll mention here. Social identity threat, we know, plays a role in these interactions as well. Stereotype threat on both the officer side, on not wanting to be seen as a racist officer, as well as, of course, on the community side, not wanting to be seen as a criminal or stereotyped because of my race or ethnicity, is strongly present in these interactions. That increases arousal, increases anxiety, decreases our working memory capacity, and it often can then lead to these interactions escalating. We also know in just analysis of police training that some of the same signs that they're being trained on as potential indicators of danger are the same symptoms of stereotype threat, are looking at, body posture and arousal and some of those same physical manifestations of just being under identity threat as being potential indicators of danger. And then I'll also say, we've looked at intragroup bias as well. So looking at differences, not just between, say, Blacks and whites, but within racial categories, and things like skin tone, of course, increasing the amount of stereotyping that officers use and increasing the likelihood of mistaken shooting decisions. And we also see that stereotypicality, or these within group differences in phenotypic appearance, also serves in some ways to protect whites. And so we can think about protecting whiteness, that the whiter an individual appears, the less force is correspondingly used at them. And so we want to think about that combination between not just, say, anti-Black bias, but also the subtle ways of in-group favoritism and protecting and upholding whiteness working in combination to lead to these disparities. So that's just some initial, topics that social psychologists have studied, how they relate to policing. And then I think, we can open it up to questions or back to Malik here. And happy to talk more about any specific studies or anything like that as well.
And thank you both for providing so much insight in response to that initial question. We have one question coming in that's gotten 14 upvotes from anonymous attendee, which states, there seems to be mixed results on different de-bias trainings for police, whether they be attacking bias directly or requiring body cams, etc. What ways would you both consider to be the most important interventions or concerns to consider to combat these problems? And I imagine maybe this is also informed by the fact that even the Minneapolis Police Department had gone through some of these trainings, and you know, we see what has happened. So.
I'm happy to start. Yeah, so I think those are all some of the more common policy responses that we've seen at this point. Of course, implicit bias training being one of the, you know, sort of buzzwords and being implemented across departments. And unfortunately, we don't have a ton of evidence of its effectiveness in any one instance. And I think that that's important to understand the limits of what these types of trainings can do, and I think the importance of the role that they play. I think officers, just like everyone, learning about the existence of implicit bias is really important. That education piece and awareness piece. If you're not even aware that implicit bias exists, then of course there's no way you're ever going to counteract it. But just like diversity trainings in general, there's never going to be a, you know, 2-hour session that someone can take that magically checks the box and gets rid of all of these biases. So I see the need and the necessity of things like implicit bias training as a piece, one step in what needs to be a larger and more comprehensive, you know, de-biasing strategy and plan. It can't be a one-time thing that, you know, is implemented, people attend for 2 hours and they never hear from it again. It needs to be actually something that is integrated consistently into the fabric of all training, not just a separate, say, here's your, you know, now you're going to a separate implicit bias training, but something that's actually just woven into the fabric of all training that's happening, as well as then, you know, in combination with examination of policies of, you know, the broader norms and structures within the police department and from leadership levels that are talking about implicit bias and actually making it an integrated part of the department. That's the type of thing that's going to be more effective. But departments that say use things as an implicit bias training to sort of say, we did implicit bias training, we're now, you know, this is no longer a problem and we never hear about it ever again, or it's not paired with actual policy change or organizational change, that's not going to be effective.
Yeah, if I could just, you know, jump onto that notion. I agree with everything that Kim said. I'll say a little more emphatically that there's no evidence that that implicit bias training changes officer behavior in any way in the field. And nevertheless, millions and millions of dollars are being spent on implicit bias training. And I worry about what the opportunity costs, both in terms of dollars and hours, labor hours are, how that time could be spent differently and those resources could be spent differently. And we know, you know, again, this is where the science comes in that we do. Calvin Lai and his 2,000 co-authors have clearly demonstrated that even when we have targeted interventions for reducing implicit bias, the small changes that we see are fleeting and they're gone in 24 hours. And, you know, that's not to say that some dosing, continuous dosing, as in sync with what Kim is saying, that's integrated more consistently with other training wouldn't maybe have a lasting effect. But at this point, we have good reason to be skeptical about any short-term intervention that is going to change the bias itself. And so what we really need to focus on is interrupting the influence of the bias. And that's where I think, reducing officer discretion is really critical. So what we see, New York is a really good example. At NYPD was sued by a class action group, and they actually won in federal court. And they have had to cease and desist for the most part in their stop and frisk. They were stopping almost 700,000 pedestrians a year in 2011, and now they're down to under 20,000 a year. And what we see there is, irrespective of what the actual underlying biases of the officers were, and by the way, there were dramatic racial disparities in who was getting stopped and racial disparities in what was resulting from those stops, where somewhat counterintuitively, whites who were searched were more likely to yield contraband and weapons because they were being subjected to a higher threshold of suspicion to get searched in the first place. Well, now we see, once those stops are reduced, a dramatic reduction in the overall harm of these generally fruitless stops, which are nevertheless alienating and disenfranchising and potentially lead to petty charges and sanctions. We see that reduction, and we're seeing a reduction in the disparities in the yield rates of those searches as well. So we can achieve a lot just by reining in the high discretion behavior until we can figure out how to rein in the biases themselves. And we shouldn't, I'll leave it at that.
So a now question that has 27 upvotes is asking, hopefully we will discuss Operation Zero versus defund the police initiatives. There's
always a delay because we have to be allowed to unmute. So I'm feeling the power. I'll take a stab at that. I'm not sure if Operation Zero is a reference to Campaign Zero, which is Sam Sing-Yongwei's program. So that's a really impressive campaign that is drawing largely on the corpus of policies that are available, including President Obama's 21st Century Task Force on Policing Reform, which of course has been set aside for the last 3 or so years, but I hope to see coming back soon. So there are a lot of recommendations out there. Campaign Zero looks at departments that are implementing some of these policy reforms and shows pretty compellingly that they see reductions in use of force and reductions in racial disparities in use of force. And that's a nice approach, and it's got a lot of support and a lot of power. As far as defunding goes, that's a term that is causing a lot of confusion. And I think the reason is that some people hear defunding and they think that means zeroing out the budget line or unfunding, as opposed to downfunding or refunding. And so I think there's a lot of support even within law enforcement leadership for reallocating some of the resources away from police departments. And I would say specifically that law enforcement would be very open to other ways to use 911 dispatch, for example, to dispatch other resources. So just as they already dispatch fire and ambulance, if they could be dispatching social services, domestic violence services and the like. Police leaders, chiefs in particular, the ones who have to get fired over these things, they don't like the extent to which their officers who have little or no training in mental health or any of those sorts of things are having to be the sole, the first, if not sole, responders to these sorts of situations. So that there's, on the operational level, there's that possibility for reallocating those funds for other kinds of services. But there's also the more cultural shift of making police just a smaller footprint and a smaller part of our lives, particularly for the over-affected communities. And that, I think, is the message of defunding, is to say, don't take it for granted that police should have such a large footprint in our lives. There is an alternative, which is a much smaller role and maybe a much more specialized role. And then I'll just say one last thing, which is that there's a hitch there. There's a danger there, which is that if we constrain policing role to purely enforcement activities, that could create an even more sort of warrior mentality among police officers, because that's all they're doing. So there has to be, in my view, some balance where they're doing that, but they're also doing positive community engagement in some way. And we have the right professionals responding to the right crises.
I think I have it now. Yeah, I would just echo a lot of those same things. I mean, we've been at CPE meetings with police chiefs that are more than happy to talk about, you know, reinvestment and reallocation of dollars from policing to social service organizations. And that's the important message that we don't want to get lost in sort of the push to defund the police. That has to come with reinvestment in particularly minority communities, as well as then the establishment of an investment in mental health services and other organizations and things that, you know, 911 can dispatch. And so somewhat of the fear in that is like, sure, let's just slash the police budget, but not actually do that additional allocation, because it really should be that sort of shifting rather than, you know, just taking that funding away. That is an important point also that Jack said of, if we do have, say, police doing a smaller footprint and then only being exposed to individuals from, say, minority communities for crime calls or these, you know, more dangerous situations, that can actually exacerbate bias. And what we kind of talk about with police officers always is that, you know, because of your job, you're disproportionately seeing this one sort of smaller, you know, segment of the larger community. And you have to actively go out and create the counter, you know, see the counter side of that through non-investigatory contacts, through community engagement, through actually, you know, times when you're not investigating or responding to a crime, you're actually just going out and connecting with the community. And right now, that's the big balance that we're trying to push for, and something that, you know, is at the center of community policing when we're talking about co-creating public safety together. Another thing that's kind of important in that way is, you know, is officers living and spending more time in the neighborhoods that they're policing. Right now, a large, you know, not all officers live in the communities that they are members of the department for. And so having that more contact, and again, non-investigatory contact, with community members and establishing those longer term relationships, some of the key pillars of community policing, all things that are talked about in the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which is a great document that lays out a lot of these key ideas and pillars and how to actually move policing forward in the 21st century, what it means to be a 21st century police officer. There's a lot of good recommendations and policy responses and ideas in there that we can look to in combination then with that, say, reallocation of some funding to more social services. Police officers will be the first ones to say, we are not trained, we don't have the skills and you know, resources to be the first responder for every call, particularly for mental health. And homelessness is also, of course, a big thing that officers are being tasked always as that first point of contact, and they would rather not be very often.
And I just wanted to jump in to say one thing that's important to bear in mind when we talk about these policy reforms is that policing is utterly decentralized in the United States. Each police department, each sheriff's department is governed by their own local authority, and their policies are largely set at the local level too. So each department has its own policy manual. There's some standardization, but no official standardization. And there are some organizations that help to disseminate best practices, policies, and the like. But at the end of the day, each of these departments does it on their own, and they have their own funding. And so while the Presidential Task Force seems very powerful and important. It's purely advisory. At the same time, there's now some discussion afoot of federal legislation. And so there is, that the House has put forward some new legislation that would actually have teeth on local policing. I don't have a lot of optimism that it's going to pass in the Senate. The Senate seems to be balking even at banning chokeholds, which is just very disappointing, painfully disappointing. But so that, you know, that's an important thing to bear in mind, that these things have to happen at the local level. Now that's a double-sided coin, because on the one hand, oh, wouldn't it be nice to just have sweeping reform across the nation? On the other hand, to the extent that there are barriers at the federal level, a lot can happen at the local and even the state level. California is also looking to pass some new laws on this, and has passed recent laws on use of force as well. So whereas in the past it had been pretty much local and the Supreme Court regulating policing, we're starting to get some state action and maybe some federal action. But still, for a long time, it's going to be locally it's going to be happening at the local level, and you can get involved at the local level.
And you know, that's been one of the biggest barriers in studying racial bias in policing, is that we don't have any standardized use of force collection. There's nothing, you know, at the federal level that is mandating certain types of reporting of even police fatalities. You know, fatalities by the police. That's why we've seen things like the Washington Post, as news organizations piecemealing together an actual database to even look at what is the number of people killed by the police each year. We don't even have that basic metric, you know, until a few years ago, where again, these non-federal organizations are trying to use news clippings as ways to actually construct this database. And so at a basic level, when we've been researching racial bias in policing, when we don't even have benchmarks or metrics to use, statistics to even study, it shows sort of the dearth of knowledge that we're able to have. And it comes back to a basic idea that, you know, what is measured matters. And when we don't even measure something, then we're signaling that there's no inherent value in this. And so that for years, we still don't have a federal database that tracks use of force just in general, and then the use of fatal force. We're signaling as a society that these are not important metrics or things that we care about. And so, you know, there's been a lot of you know, researchers and Center for Policing Equity and voluntary organizations trying to actually standardize and create some of this joint knowledge and share data and statistics. But what we really need is federal level legislation that is at least standardizing and collecting this information. I think that's one of the things that's been proposed in the House bill. Like Jack, I'm somewhat not optimistic that all of this is going to pass, but we do know what are some of the things that can help, and that would just be one small step that would allow for analysis and understanding as a first step for counteracting.
Thank you both for all of that insight. And now Mark Patterson has asked, for any of the speakers, are there must-know papers that represent the gold standard of work in this area?
God, you know, the availability heuristic is going to make me seem shamelessly self-promoting if I answer this question. But I will say humbly that my students and I, Catherine Spencer and Amanda Charbonneau, published a paper on implicit bias in policing that I think kind of provides a framework for that. And I don't know, Kim, other must reads?
Yeah, I mean, I think just for some, again, kind of overview and background on, you know, what do we know and what do we not know about racial bias in policing. I'll plug a couple of my things, and then also just to talk about you know, some other articles or research. But I do have a whole Journal of Social Issues special issue on this topic, on what social science research says about violence against racial and ethnic minorities. There's social psychologists that contributed to that. There's a paper by Jack and his team as well as scholars from other disciplines also sort of weighing in on this topic on what we know and what we don't know. There's also two sort of larger review pieces in SIPR, Social Issues and Policy Review, one by myself and Dr. Phil Goff, and one with myself and Karen Martin, another one of Jack's former students, that look at an overview of racial bias in policing and policy responses. So those are good sort of starting reads. I would highly recommend Jack's book, Suspect Race, of course, as well as a good, again, overview of these topics. And then if you want to look at some, key studies, of course, initial work on shooter bias by Josh Carell, Jennifer Eberhardt's work on phenotypic stereotypicality, police officers being more likely to perceive darker skinned African Americans as criminals compared to lighter skinned African Americans and whites. And then, more, I would say just, some broader work on the dehumanization as well. I think Phil Goff's paper on the Black ape connection, and also the dehumanization of Black children in their interactions with law enforcement are some good initial reads, I would say.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, Kim, those are great. And there are probably thousands of wonderful papers in social and personality psychology that are either applicable or have been directly applied to policing. But in terms of general overviews, there's really been a dearth there. And that was one of the things I discovered in writing my book, was when I looked to do due diligence to see what's been written on the topic of racial profiling, all of the books that had been written on racial profiling had essentially excluded a discussion of stereotyping. Mm-hmm. And that's what, racial profiling is, stereotype-based policing. So there was one book by David Harris, who's really great, that had a paragraph on stereotypes in a whole book. And so, this is one reason why I feel like psychologists can be less shy about this work and be applying more directly to it.
And piggybacking off of that, Kristen Anderson asks, in your work with the police, are officers open to learning about their own biases and stereotypes? Do they understand that research exists that can help them and others, or do they stick to their gut and dismiss ivory tower Poindexters?
In my own work, I'd say that there's the whole variety of responses. I think a lot of us as professors or educators, we can sort of think about the level of responses that we have in a classroom when we're teaching about this, from reactance, all the way through kind of understanding and acceptance there as well. So, I've seen the whole range. I've certainly seen officers, disengaged from this topic and think that it's, specifically targeting the police, and, claiming that everyone's racist, to, of course I have implicit biases. Everyone else has implicit biases. Why would I be different than them? And, and that's more of the message that we're trying to send in those types of teaching situations. So I think one of the things that we know with implicit bias and any sort of intervention in that way is that individuals have to be motivated and actually care about it, or there's never going to be any sort of change that happens. So, most officers that I've worked with have a pretty good perspective, you know, in that way, and are understanding the importance of implicit bias. If everyone has implicit bias, why is it, you know, officers have to be better than the average person at counteracting and controlling it based on their job? But there certainly are still officers that, you know, see it as just another diversity, equity, training or buzzword that, you know, needs to check the box and move off from. So I think I've certainly seen the range of responses. I would say in general, most of the officers I've worked with have at least somewhat of a positive orientation towards it, but that is by no means every officer.
Yeah, I would add that I would make a distinction between leadership and rank and file in this respect. So I would go so far as to say that most major city police chiefs are downright hungry for this sort of thing. Because again, they're the ones whose legacy and job rises and falls. And, you know, Chief Arredondo in Minneapolis is an outstanding chief, but I don't know how much longer he's going to last because of Derek Chauvin. And obviously there's a toxic culture in Minneapolis that the chief has not been able to undo, but I can attest that he's been working night and day to undo it. And so the chiefs are desperate. And then when you actually talk to the rank and file, you know, you get a lot of folded arms. On the plus side, again, they're human and we're human, and human interaction, if it can happen slowly enough with enough deliberation, you can get through to people. So I've had the experience of doing a ride along with an officer and finding out at the end of the ride along that he had Googled me before, and he pulls off into a dark parking lot to confront me about my anti-police perspective. And so I learned in the process that my Google presence was tilted and was representing me as a critic. But I also had that half-hour conversation with him where I was able to explain the research and explain that we're not accusing police. And by the end of it, you know, we were close to being on the same page. So there is the opportunity. The other thing that this opens up is one of the problems with the implicit bias training that's being offered by, you know, for-profit vendors is that their criteria for success is how much the officers like the training. Mm-hmm. And so at the end of the training, they'll do a survey of officers, and they may even ask them about what their beliefs are about race and crime and the like. But they, to date, we don't see any effect on officer performance in the few instances where it's been looked at. But they've considered a success if the officers stay engaged, say they like the training, say they learned something from it. And that is not, you know, what we should be looking for. That's not the litmus test. We want to see change in actual performance. But that illustrates how difficult it is to get through. And, you know, some people view it as success enough just to kind of get through at the surface level.
Maureen Coyle asks, do you think our priority should be screening individuals who are applying to be police officers or training existing police officers? And further, I know some of Goff's work has addressed insecurity about masculinity as an important variable. Essentially, is the problem more about who is hired or how they are trained?
Kim, you want to go first?
Sure, I can start with that, and I guess I would say it's, you know, the problem is a combination of both of those things. You know, I think Jack mentioned earlier that, you know, there is some personality types that are more likely to go into law enforcement. When we look at things like social dominance orientation, officers tend to have higher levels of social dominance orientation compared to communities. So we do see that there's some sort of, you know, people that are self-selecting into this profession, which has been exacerbated within the last few years in this context that, you know, departments are often understaffed, that they're not able to recruit enough officers to replace those that are retiring, which is also then leading to the rehiring of officers, you know, after they're retiring there as well. So I think that there's, some personality variables in that way, but then of course once they get into the system and power structure and norms and policies that are rewarding certain types of behaviors and things that it gets exacerbated in that manner. So if we're thinking about reform, certainly actually changes to the existing structure, the existing, as social psychologists, of course, the larger overarching system and policies is going to be a huge part of that. And then, selecting it to then think about the individuals within that environment. And so kind of that combination is what I would say.
Yeah, I would concur, and I would add that one thing that could really improve policing in America would be if they could recruit more women. They're about 12% of the force right now, and 51% of the population. And one of the most poignant moments in my experience of working with police was being at a meeting with a bunch of chiefs where, unsolicited, an old white male chief from a major city stood up and just offered that it was when women started joining the force that he felt like his department really professionalized. And I'm not entirely sure what all the factors are underlying that, but it seems to bear out in the research as well. And that would be one way, but I don't know how to achieve that, but that would be good. And of course, retaining and promoting women as well. We do see more and more women chiefs, and that's a good sign, although the Oakland chief just got fired. So that's the other thing. Police chiefs last about 3 years on average, and she got fired 3 years almost to the day after being hired. So, and then in terms of training, well, there's something I've been wanting to say, which is that one thing that can be done in terms of training is that the really influential training experience is the field training. And so they might spend 4 to 8 months in the academy, and then they hit the streets on probation, and they get some field training officer, and there's huge variation in the experience and the mentality of those officers. But one thing that often happens is that officers get deployed in their first rotation to the graveyard shift. And so if they're patrolling an urban area in particular, they're seeing people who are out in the middle of the night, and everything just looks more dangerous and ominous. And they'll tell you, I've had one officer tell me, his first shift was the graveyard, and then he got rotated onto the day shift in the same neighborhood, and he didn't even recognize the neighborhood. And I have, gotten the attention of one major city chief with the idea that maybe these officers should be rotated onto day shifts coming out of the academy, because, as I put it, you don't learn to sail in a storm. And the chief really resonated with that. But this raises the other big issue, which is that the unions probably won't let that happen, because seniority indicates whether you get the peachy shift or not. And so there are politics and labor politics and all of these things that get in the way of something that I think would actually have a big impact and be fairly straightforward and easy to do, were it not for labor issues.
Yeah, I think, what this comes down to is sort of changing the definition of what it means to be a 21st century police officer, and, moving away from the sort of warrior mentality of the 80s and 90s into what it means now, again, as a 21st century officer with, de-escalation and community engagement, and those types of skills, just as, if not more important than, physical prowess and force being deployed. And so if we can shift what that actual, job and definition of what it means to be an officer and be a good officer, it's not, how many arrests and use of force, things you've deployed, but rather on the community engagement side and community policing side, then that's going to attract different types of people into that profession, which then, also can work towards changing that culture as well. So that's where a big shift needs to happen.
Amen.
Well, I know that we're at the just about at the time barrier. I'm going to ask one final question from Allison McNeil. With just we just have a couple of minutes left. But how do you fundamentally change the culture of policing organizations, e.g., the brotherhood, loyalty, strength, force, etc.? Is it even possible?
The simple answer is I don't know. Although I do again think that recruiting more women will change the culture, and there's lots of good reasons to believe that. But again, I want to come back to Kim's point that we have to move away from the warrior mentality, and I think even the guardian mentality. I mean, who are they guarding from whom? Mm-hmm. So there has to be public safety officer needs to be the description, and they need to be working towards shifting that culture. But what I see over and over again is that one of the dominant themes of policing is that the number one priority is that you get home alive at the end of your shift. Mm-hmm. And that's totally understandable, but it creates a degree of vigilance, and it prioritizes fear over competence. And so that's a cultural change that has to be made, that officers cannot be thinking about just how to deal with physical threats, and there's just way too much of that. I think we are at a moment in history where there's an opening for these kinds of changes, but if history repeats itself, then we'll all be disappointed. But please don't let that be the ending point. So Kim, say something inspiring.
Oh, great. Well, I think that we do know we're not starting from scratch. We do know a lot about community policing and how this sort of co-creation of public safety between, officers as well as then, organizations within the community and just the community members themselves. And it's that paired joint partnership and structure that increases trust and also just improves public safety to begin with. So we have models, we do know steps that are more effective than the traditional warrior guardian mentality. And there's been variance in how much departments across the United States are truly adopting those types of models versus using it as, again, a buzzword of, oh, community policing, we do that. So the more that more that departments and chiefs develop structures and really institute community policing, with maybe, again, paired with this reinvestment into mental health services and other types of necessary social support structures, to me, that is the future in creating a more equitable department and outcome.
Great. And really briefly, I remember when I was on Capitol Hill and with a case of mistaken identity, had 15 police officers converge upon me. It was after a couple of hours being detained, the one female officer on duty who helped to diffuse the situation and have me to be let go. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to the audience for taking time out to share your questions and ideas. Kimberly and Jack, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. And as a social personality psychology community, collectively, we have relevant knowledge, agency, expertise, and we should continue to be creative in employing immediate and long-term strategies for research, intervention, policy change, teaching, and also for self-preservation. And with that, I'd like to pass it back over to Annie Drinkard.
All right, thank you so much. On behalf of SPSP, thank you for attending today's town hall, and thank you again to our speakers, Jack Glaser, Kimberly Barsamian Kahn, and Malik Boykin. So thank you to everyone for participating today. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank
Goodbye.
you, everyone. Thank you all.
Thank you.